All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Doug Irwin. I'm a professor in the economics department and co-director of the Political Economy Project. Thank you for showing up today. Just want to announce three events next week that might be of interest to you. Next Monday in Rocky One, we're going to have Daniel DiMartino of Columbia University speaking on socialism and Venezuela. He's a fascinating, young, dynamic graduate student at Columbia from Venezuela who can speak personally about the experience, but put it in a nice framework as well. That will be in Rocky 1 at 5 p.m. next Monday. Next Wednesday, also in Rocky 1 at 4:30, we'll have Tony Banout of the University of Chicago speaking about his book on free inquiry and free expression on campus. The University of Chicago has been a leader here in this regard, and of course our president came from the University of Chicago, and so he's going to speak about how Chicago has approached those issues. If that's not enough for you, next Thursday from 5 to 6, so first of all, Tony Banout at 4:30, Rocky 1. Thursday at 5 to 6, Are Tariffs Good for America? This is sponsored by the Rockefeller Center, and it's part of their 100 Days program. And I will be in conversation with Dominic Pino of National Review and Stephen Vaughn of King Spalding, a law firm in Washington, offering two different perspectives on President Trump's tariff policies. And so that will be next Thursday, 5 to 6 in Filene. So conservatism is a force in American political life. We all know that, but we don't always appreciate it in academia, where there's sort of a skew in terms of the political spectrum. But it sort of behooves us to understand and try to understand what conservatism, where it came from, its intellectual influences, its political influences, and there's no better person to help us explore that topic than Joshua Tait. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. He earned his PhD in history from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and he's working on a book on the intellectual history of conservatism as an ideology and the identity among intellectuals in the 20th century, in particular how it has affected American politics. He's written widely for venues such as the Bulwark, National Interest, Washington Post, and Tablet, and he will speak, then answer questions. Welcome to campus, Joshua Tait.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug, and thank you for having me. As you can see, I am currently a postdoctoral fellow cross-posted at the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Ronald Reagan Institute, which I think is an interesting combination of presidents. If you know anything about conservative mythology, certainly. I planned this talk perhaps a little bit long, so I apologize in advance if I'm droning on. I hope to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. And if you're familiar with the story of conservative intellectual history, some of the things I talk about this evening may be familiar, and I hope that I have a different or a new take on some of the things if you've heard it before. Primarily, I'm going to focus on, well, conservative thought from Buckley to Trump is an enormous topic, obviously. We're talking about 75 years at least of history, probably more by any reckoning. And Buckley to Trump, there's a lot of currents and countercurrents that go on through both of, from one pole to the other. Today, I'm primarily going to focus on what I'm going to call the traditionalist branch of conservatism and the frustration that traditionalist conservatives felt among other conservatives, and ways in which that helps us understand parts of the present moment. Also, if you're familiar with conservative intellectual history, you know there's a cliche that ideas have consequences, taken from the title of a book by Richard Weaver. So I'm going to start very quickly with some definitions. By conservative, you could mean just about anything. I'm an intellectual historian by training, so primarily the people that I'm talking about this evening are academics, writers, philosophers, scholars, poets, people whose business is ideas. But I don't think, and I know for sure that's not the limit to what conservative or conservatism could cover. That's just what I'm going to be talking about this evening. I also think that conservatism is almost always a form of right-wing thought, and by right, I mean belief in the naturalness or the ineradicability or the goodness, or at least benign nature of social and political hierarchies. And I take right to be in tension with a left-wing view that sees hierarchies as something that need to be dismantled. And then in terms of a time frame, like I said before, you could push this back as far as you like, but I'm starting in 1945, and I'm going to kind of jog all the way up to the present, but the focus will be in the 50s and 60s. I should also say the Buckley in the title refers to William F. Buckley, who celebrates his, well, he doesn't, but he would celebrate his 100-year birthday today if he was still alive. He arouses complicated feelings. On the one hand, it's very easy to find a great many people with very nice things to say about William F. Buckley. He was a charming man, a genuinely good friend, a colleague, a good interlocutor, a person who I think did bring gatekeeping, earnestness, and noblesse oblige to the American right. I've already said something too offensive. But on the other hand, though, it's very easy across Buckley's prodigious writing and speaking career to find him doing things like defending the egregious racism of Jim Crow, dismissing the witness of James Baldwin, defending the US security and intelligence apparatus to the point of lying, and equivocating and to some extent covering up Watergate, and suggesting that AIDS sufferers should be tattooed with warnings for reasons of public health. So he has a complex legacy. He also was not an intellectual so much as he was an intellectual entrepreneur and performer, and he was also an impressive network builder. Here, I'm using Buckley as a stand-in for the 1950s and kind of the timeline up to Trump, and as a stand-in for the conservative intellectual movement that he helped coalesce around a number of things, including his magazine, National Review, political organizations like Young Americans for Freedom and the Intercollegiate Society for Individualists, as well as politicians like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, and eventually most of the Republican Party. And in the realm of ideas, which is where I'm going to dwell, on a formulation derisively but usefully known as fusionism. When Buckley and people like Richard Weaver, the author of Ideas Have Consequences, looked at the political scene they inhabited in the late 40s and early 1950s, they felt defeated. The New Deal coalition dominated politically, at least until Eisenhower, and even then, the conservatives resented Eisenhower as a Me Too Republican who only wanted to tinker with the dramatic political changes of the New Deal rather than roll them back. The conservatives' political champion, Robert Taft, had been sidelined repeatedly by the Republican establishment and died prematurely in 1953. And in any case, Taft had styled himself as an authentic liberal, not a conservative. Certainly, historians have pointed at deeper currents in American culture and political life, things like reflexive faith in capitalism, the strength of various forms of Christianity, or the persistence of white supremacy, and even racism, especially codified in the South, but endemic across the nation, as reasons that the American right might have felt more long-term confidence. But the lived experience for conservative intellectuals during this period was one of relative isolation and despair. Richard Weaver wanted to call Ideas Have Consequences the adverse descent. Another conservative, Russell Kirk, wanted his landmark book to be titled The Conservative's Route. A contemporary analyst of conservative thought subtitled the second edition of his book, Conservatism, The Thankless Persuasion. And the towering liberal critic, Lionel Trilling, could say, in words he meant, at least partially as a lament, that conservatism manifested only, quote, an action or in irritable mental gestures which seek to resemble ideas. Against this pervasive sense of dominant liberalism, men like Weaver, and especially a writer named Whittaker Chambers, made a public, very well publicized critique of modernity. They championed a lost sense of the divine or the absolute, or usually but not always a Christian one, over a scientific and naturalistic understanding of reality. They told a story of secular decline. The fruit of this change was modernity, deracinated and unhappy, in which the social ills and geopolitical crises that they saw all around them were all symptoms of a wider loss of faith. The problem, as Weaver argued in 1948, was an intellectual and cultural one, hence Ideas Have Consequences. A person and a society, their basic relationship with reality was governed by beliefs, often culturally imposed intuitions about the cosmos. And like the proverbial butterfly whose wing flaps eventually produce a tornado, a change in thinking that Weaver dated back to the 14th century. Nominalism had set in process an intellectual decay with massive social repercussions. Modernity, he thought, had reaped the whirlwind. Weaver saw evidence of this decay everywhere. He saw it in education, he saw it in music, he saw it in art and politics. As a white Southerner, he particularly detested jazz music, and he saw it as symbolic of an embrace of culture, of barbarism. Whittaker Chambers, who was significantly more famous than Weaver, as you may know because of his role in one of the major news events of 1949, the Hiss case, dramatized the importance of a society's ideas even more vividly than Weaver. Human societies, he wrote, live by faith and die when faith dies. In his memoir of the case, he wrote, 2 faiths were on trial. The first was freedom, by which he meant a political reading of the Christian Bible. And the second was, quote, man's second oldest faith, something whispered in the first days of creation under the tree of knowledge of good and evil, ye shall be as gods. Here, like Weaver, Chambers found the basic fault of modernity to be the substitution of human knowledge and rationality for a metaphysical absolute. In Chambers' case, he meant the Christian God. Chambers, who knew a lot about communism, believed that communists were right to call themselves revolutionaries, for they asked, quote, the most revolutionary question in history, God or man? In the political realm, modernity, these conservatives thought, modernity produced lukewarm, hollow liberals who were both the symptoms of this metaphysical failure and also spreaders of a modern pathogen. And against a liberal elite, Weaver and Chambers pointed to the common people holding reflexively to older pieties. I think it's useful to remember that Chambers and Weaver were not, I think, conservatives as we would necessarily understand them today, or at least they didn't start that way. They occasionally took populist political positions. Both had very radical periods and retained a distrust of commerce and a dislike of the bourgeois middle class who they blamed for the triumph of modernity. And both of them also, in their own way, looked skeptically at technology. Machines had made the world socialistic, machines which were the product of science, and the right must confront this reality. And I would also say that even though I started by saying their lived reality was one of overwhelming liberalism, they were pushing an extreme version of a story that had some contemporary resonance. Underneath the dominant liberalism lay a sense of anxiety. For the middle classes, for all of the middle classes' high standards of living in the post-war period, the liberal historian Arthur Schlesinger detected a widespread unease. He saw it in the support for Senator Joseph McCarthy's wild accusations of communist infiltration, and he also recognized it in the uptick of middle-class religious attendance. He called both manifestations of inner unrest. Likewise, when the sociologist Daniel Bell recalled the era, he thought the cumulative shocks of the World War, Holocaust, and clashes of the early Cold War had traumatized the intellectual class. For Bell's more sophisticated people, inner unrest didn't lead to church attendance or McCarthy support necessarily, but they sought meaning in Kafka's fiction, in the existentialism of Sartre or Heidegger, or the theology of Kierkegaard or neo-orthodoxy, or absurdism at the theater. And of course, the threat of nuclear annihilation overshadowed the intellectual landscape with dread. The bomb, the contemporary historian Richard Hofstadter wrote, quote, set in motion a current of conservatism. People now thought of political change with a new wariness and cling to what they have. Like I said, neither Weaver nor Chambers fit easily or comfortably into the conservative framework that we think about today. And running parallel to their metaphysical critique of modernity and liberalism were a bunch of academics and writers who worked to rehabilitate the term and the concept conservative in the American context. Obviously, if we think of the United Kingdom, you have the Conservative Party. It wasn't really something equivalent today, in the United States. Instead, you would say the conservative wing or the Republican Party or the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. There wasn't a conservative party. These men were working to rehabilitate the idea of conservatism. I'll skip the details, but the one who emerges most from that is a guy named Russell Kirk. I mentioned him earlier. He is the lower picture there. He was born in 1918 in a lower middle class family in Michigan. I think of him as an owlish but romantic man whose academic studies led him to develop a consciously conservative aesthetic and political ideal drawn especially from British conservatism. For Kirk, the Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke represented the beau ideal of conservatism. In 1953, he published a revised version of his dissertation as The Conservative Mind, which became a surprising bestseller. The success of his book helped legitimate the term conservative and the idea of conservatism as something more than just a block or branch of partisan politics. Kirk suggested that while conservatism wasn't a rationalist ideology, it was nonetheless a coherent worldview. He presented 6 canons that defined the conservative outlook. They were, 1, that society is providential and political problems are ultimately moral or religious, in that way quite similar to Weaver and Chambers. 2, that traditional life is superior to equalitarianism and utilitarianism. 3, that hierarchy is necessary and social leveling causes despair. 4, property and freedom are intrinsically linked. 5, since human beings are appetitive and emotional, tradition is superior to rationalism for helping corral them politically. And 6, it is important to recognize the distinction between change and reform and be skeptical of progress and innovation. Kirk himself was a partisan of Robert Taft and the Republican right. Politically, he believed in small government, strict constitutionalism, federalism, and isolationism. And not only did Kirk's fame link his philosophy of conservatism with his specific policy preferences, members of the Republican right, like Senator Bricker of Ohio, started to use Kirk's language of conservatism to justify their own positions and give them more respectability than arguments they've been making for decades, more respectability. Chambers did not think that Kirk's tradition was enough to go on. What do Kirk and his Burke have to say, he asked, about the victims of the Holocaust or totalitarian states? Only the Catholic Church has dared look steadfastly at that torrent. Nevertheless, over time, in a fairly short order, Kirk's tradition-based conservatism merged with the metaphysical critique of modernity advanced by Weaver and Chambers. Kirk himself leaves that, I think, open in his first canon, which says conservatism has a providential view of the world. This, despite Chambers' dissent, within conservative intellectual circles, this combination of metaphysical rejection of modernity and appeal to tradition to assert a hierarchical, God-fearing order of life eventually earned the shorthand traditionalism or traditionalist conservatism. Traditionalists were typically Orthodox Christians, usually Roman Catholics, and quite commonly converts. After years of skepticism, Kirk himself entered the church in 1964. And at least in intellectual and activist circles, the traditionalist position became one of the constitutive parts of an anti-liberal coalition that made up conservatism. I say one of the constitutive parts because there is an alternative tradition, one I think with, in many ways, deeper roots in the American political tradition, that was also deeply critical of New Deal liberalism, and that was the individualist tradition, or what we might now call libertarianism. The libertarian position was pro-free enterprise, anti-big government, states' rights, hyper-Jeffersonian, and the libertarians claimed not only to be an authentic expression of liberalism, but also the authentic expression of the American political tradition writ large. Despite the fact that both of these streams of thought opposed the New Deal and New Deal liberals, I think the traditionalist position and the libertarian one were not obvious allies. As we have seen, Weaver and Chambers were at least initially skeptics about the relationship between free market economics and culture. Kirk was likewise critical of libertarian economists, despite his Midwestern republicanism. And when the ex-communist libertarian Frank Meyer reviewed Russell Kirk's book, he called Kirk valuable and stimulating, but also aggravating because he ignored liberty. Kirk had missed what would become Frank Meyer's pet idea, the American fusion of individualism and conservatism. Because Kirk paid little attention to liberty, Meyer argued, he was unreliable on the only issue that mattered, stopping the state's accrual of power to himself. A little after this review, Meyer suggested conservatives were communitarians who fetishized traditions but lacked a robust defense of liberty. Meanwhile, many of the intellectuals associated with the libertarian position, people like Max Eastman or Friedrich Hayek or Ludwig von Mises, were secular moderns with no real interest, I think, in a religious framework for their views. Kirk never really got over the bad reviews that Frank Meyer gave him. He considered Meyer and Meyer's editor, Frank Kodorov, to be ossified Benthamites, and was annoyed, but also amused that, quote, two radical Jewish atheists, one an anarchist and the other a reformed Marxist, were posing as defenders of 100% Americanism. In other ways, Kirk served as a convenient target in another libertarian conservative episode. At the 10th annual meeting of the neoliberal Mont Pelerin Society, Friedrich Hayek gave a paper titled "Why I Am Not a Conservative." Kirk kind of was in the background there as a target. Hayek rejected conservatism grounded on metaphysical claims about social order. While they might find common cause, especially in America, Hayek thought conservatism and true liberalism, the neoliberalism that he wanted to promote, could not be reconciled. To be clear, Hayek meant a more European blood and soil conservatism than the Anglo-American tradition Kirk stood for, but there were real disagreements here. The two men certainly felt at odds, and the debate played into an internal Mont Pelerin Society disagreement where Kirk and conservatism had become shorthand for a conflict that Kirk thought pitted Christians against secularized Jews who were civil libertine and quasi-Benthamite liberals hostile to Christianity and therefore conservatism. Nevertheless, in the mid-1950s, magazines like The Freeman and then Buckley's National Review, or in books published by conservative presses like the Henry Regnery Company, people like Buckley, Kirk, and others were beginning to bring traditionalist and libertarian anti-New Deal writers together in a multi-pronged attack on the political order of the day. What united the traditionalist and libertarian critiques of the New Deal was their often always strident opposition to modern liberals and modern liberalism, which they saw as a pathway to statist totalitarianism. To that alliance, traditionalism brought several things. It brought a thoroughgoing critique of liberalism and modernity as something empty, dangerous, necessarily weak on communism, and ultimately anti-human. It provided a useful just so story about the problems of the present day. And its orthodox Christian and especially Catholic forms, it suggested alternative institutions and worldviews with robust commitments and identity. It had a strong sense of norms, gender, sexual, intellectual, legal, that should be defended. It brought a cataclysmic sense of what was at stake in partisan political battles. And all of this was given further legitimacy as tradition, the inheritance of Western civilization. And finally, in large part through the work of Russell Kirk and the public reception of his writing, it all had a name. It could all be usefully called conservatism. For a growing group of intellectuals and activists, the idea of conservatism proved very compelling. And it suggested a logic. Conservatism is a coherent ideology opposed to liberalism. Therefore, its chief components must also be complementary. So in the late 50s and early 1960s, men from the libertarian and traditionalist camp attempted to hammer out a satisfactory theory of conservatism. In one sense, they succeeded, and in another, they failed. There's a great story about Buckley, William F. Buckley, putting his magazine together and trying to get, I guess, all of the leading lights of conservatism under one banner. He tried to get Chambers, who was sick and didn't really want to do it for a variety of reasons, and he flattered him and flew him around on a plane and all sorts. He really wanted Kirk as well, but Kirk wouldn't do it because Buckley already had Frank Meyer on the masthead, and Kirk didn't want his name to be tarnished by association with the people he'd been calling free maniacs and Benthamites. Buckley vouched for Meyer's good faith and pointed to something he called transcendent affinities between the two. Kirk and Meyer did eventually work together for the same magazine. Neither of them worked in the New York office. Maybe that helped their working relationship, maybe it didn't, but it did eventually come about. But there were other people working to try and make the synthesis functional. For instance, in 1960, two political theorists from Notre Dame, Stanley Parry and Gerhard Niemeyer, set up a conference in Chicago for, quote, all the really important people in the conservative world. At the conference, they managed to get Hayek to represent the libertarian view alongside Frank Meyer, although Frank Meyer was at this stage taking more of a complementarian position. And the organizers, Parry, a priest, and Niemeyer were strongly in the traditionalist camp, so they stacked the conference with allies, also bringing along Richard Weaver, Henry Regnery, and others, including Buckley's brother-in-law, an intense Catholic convert named Brent Bozell. Having stacked the deck in their favor, the traditionalists felt the conference had been a success. Everyone had found surprising agreement about the centrality of virtue, the importance of the spiritual, of natural law, and they had all agreed on the premise that virtue presupposes freedom, as in, you cannot have virtue in a political society unless it is a free society. Niemeyer and Parry left the conference feeling confident. They thought they had set up a functioning basis for a conservative synthesis. But I think without realizing, they had given some of the game away. They had accepted that theirs, the traditionalist problem, was a moral cultural one, and obviously it was. But in grabbing this concession, they had accepted the premise that virtue presupposes freedom, i.e., in politics, freedom is the first order question. And in doing so, they had accepted the validity of the libertarian position about the unconstrained market economy and the primacy of freedom in the as an ordering political principle. What they thought they had agreed to, a balance and tension between public interest and religious philosophical truth, was actually libertarian political premises and vague cultural promises. But while the scholars debated, as is so often the case, events got away from them. 4 months after the Chicago conference, 90 young conservatives met in Buckley's home to launch Young Americans for Freedom, or YAF. There, a guy named Stan Evans, who had been at the Chicago conference, drafted the Sharon Statement, where he took the tentative conclusions of the Chicago conference and turned it into a fighting manifesto. The statement pronounced that the individual's use of his God-given free will is the foremost of transcendent values. Liberty is indivisible, and therefore political liberty was existentially linked to economic liberty. The government should be limited to the protection of freedom, to national defense, and to, quote, the administration of justice, by which I take them to mean enforcing contracts. National Review called it a tough-as-nails statement. Buckley delighted that conservatism had, quote, been accepted both by Russell Kirk and Frank Meyer as designating their distinct but complementary, even symbiotic positions. This is, I think, often looked to in a broad view of conservative history as the moment where the synthesis was happily made and was one of the founding documents. But behind the scenes, there was less rejoicing. Gerhard Niemeyer, whose son had been present at the YAF conference, wrote privately to Buckley that, quote, this formula forces one to take a stand, and my stand is against it. He had found it too economic and therefore too libertarian. It made choice an intrinsic good, he contended, and in doing so, destroyed the basis for genuine political community. Quote, this is the condition of utter unfreedom, he wrote in a private letter. Quote, the individual standing alone before the state, powerless before the sole possessor of power, normless before the sole creator of norms, a self-centered pygmy before the leviathan of government bureaucracy. Niemeyer thought conservatives needed to restore pre-liberal values. Are today's conservatives nothing but last century's liberals, he asked. Meanwhile, a senior editor at National Review, James Burnham, a strict logician, found the Sharon Statement, quote, false and contradictory. The National Review's publisher privately admitted he had, quote, never been entirely at ease with Myers and Evans and the Sharon Statements and my own rather too breezy assumption that a large amount of individual freedom somehow tends to maximize the opportunities to lead a virtuous life. Buckley didn't publish Niemeyer's letter or any of the dissent, in part because YAF was already growing rapidly on campuses across the country. Also, a second document came out in 1960 compounding the case for fusionist conservatism. In this case, Senator Barry Goldwater's The Conscience of a Conservative, a book ghostwritten by Buckley's brother-in-law, Brent Bozell. As Goldwater/Bozell contended, conservatism meant freedom and order, a balance captured in the Constitution. The Conscience of a Conservative sold into the hundreds of thousands and made Goldwater a political star on the right. So by the end of the 1960s, by the end of 1960, with National Review on the newsstands, YAF chapters across the country, and Goldwater as a political figurehead, fusionism was a fact, like it or not. There was still time, though, for one last major disagreement, this time between Frank Meyer, the old warhorse for freedom, and this time Brent Bozell, the Goldwater ghostwriter, standing in for virtue. Basically, Meyer had written an essay where he was trying to do some doctrinal policing. He was trying to write out pacifist libertarians out of conservatism as being too soft on communism, but also write out theocratic traditionalists who wanted to emulate, Franco's Spain. But something in it twigged a response from Brent Bozell. The two were friends, but Bozell had been on his own intellectual journey. He and his family had recently moved to Spain, where in Franco's regime, he had become enamored with the Catholic culture there. Coming back to the United States, he found fusionism insufficient. In a winding essay, Bozell doubted, quote, whether a movement dominated by libertarianism can be responsive to the root causes of Western disintegration. If freedom is the first principle in politics, virtue is at best the second one, and the programmatic aspects of the movement that affirms that hierarchy will be determined accordingly. In other words, if the libertarians insist that on the freedom first approach, this presumption will shape the entire movement in a libertarian direction. Frank Meyer responded fairly quickly, making a range of arguments, one of which was essentially, too late, Brent, the horse has bolted. Conservatives already have a double allegiance to virtue and to liberty. You could see it in YAF, and you could see it, twisting the knife, in The Conscience of a Conservative, which he knew Bozell had written. Historians of conservatism, and I think conservatives themselves, return to this debate over and over again because it puts a really fine point on, I think, what was a real rolling debate at the time. You have the sense that there was the libertarian argument, the traditionalist rejoinder, and the fact that, well, fusionism is a fact, let's all get on with it. However, shortly after Goldwater's monumental defeat in 1964, Frank Meyer worried that the synthesis he had championed was not enough. Conservatives had, quote, constructed a demonology to contemplate, by which he meant the many-layered attack on liberalism, but they had not created, quote, an avant-garde to move forward, theorize, and explore. Even Meyer had found the fusionist synthesis to be incomplete, but it had bolted and become dogma in the hands of YAF members, Republican politicians, and in magazines like National Review. I think it's worth briefly mentioning that we have, I think, come to accept the fusionist idea as, virtue and liberty as the natural position of the conservative movement, but that understates how extreme it was in a lot of ways. Bozell, a former communist, had an extremely limited view of what the state ought to be and should be. It was very close to a minimal, libertarian state, which had national defense, police powers, and enforcement of contracts. He also refused to accept any difference between Cold War liberalism and communists. He thought they were all variations of a form of collectivist statism. And I think that in itself is a breathtaking move to put that at the center of a political ideology. Bozell hammered Meyer on all of these issues. And he argued that fusionism had left conservatives ultimately bereft of tools to oppose liberal politics based on legal claims made on the basis of freedom, choice, and rights. If we're putting freedom or liberty as the prime political order, whenever liberals are going to make the case that we need rights or freedom, conservatives have no real tools to defeat it. Conservatism implicitly delegated culture to the amoral economic sphere, with a deregulated and increasingly financialized market sped up by the disruptive impacts of capitalism. Bozell argued that what we ended up with was libertarianism with traditionalist trappings. But at the same time, Bozell was an extremist himself. Frank Meyer said the inner logic of the argument that Bozell had made was that of theocratic Spain. And ultimately, the end point of the traditionalist position was something far beyond the American political tradition. Bozell wasn't Meyer wasn't wrong to make this case. Bozell's thought and intense religious commitments quickly led him to the fringe. He was a proto-integralist, if that means anything to you. And as early as 1962, when he was debating Meyer, Bozell had already been workshopping a thesis about God's civilization that made his allies nervous. Within a decade, Bozell had broken entirely from the conservative movement for a mystical form of politics. You can see here, he was arrested in 1970 for protesting at an abortion clinic on George Washington University's campus, I think, where he was dressed up as a Spanish Carlist and carrying a large cross. I think that the failure of the traditionalist position was an inevitable one. It's unclear what their policy prescriptions would have been. It's unclear even among themselves what they agreed upon. They simply agreed upon the importance of a metaphysical position. It was a belief in metaphysics rather than a specific one in general. It's also the case that the libertarians within the conservative movement were primarily economists, lawyers, and therefore the ones coming up with actual policy suggestions. The metaphysical conservatives tended to be poets or philosophers, and therefore very much in the realm of kind of abstract ideas. But the traditionalist conservatives felt as though they were betrayed. I'll run through this, but in the Reagan administration, there were a number of issues where they felt like they had got the short end of the stick. The libertarian position had undermined the traditionalist one. They would point to things like the failure to reduce the prevalence of divorce or liberal divorce laws, Reagan's opposition to California's anti-gay Proposition 6 in 1978, certainly the appointment of insufficiently conservative justices like Sandra Day O'Connor and then later Anthony Kennedy, Reagan's support for a right-to-life constitutional amendment in principle, but his refusal to expend political capital, and then the Reagan administration's efforts to promote safe sex as a response to the AIDS crisis rather than, well, who knows. Fittingly, Reagan's last Supreme Court appointee, Anthony Kennedy, wrote the majority decision in 2015's Obergefell and v. Hodges that legalized same-sex marriage in 2015. Quote, "The Constitution promises liberty to all within its reach, a liberty that includes certain specific rights that allow persons within the lawful realm to define and express their identity." This is, I think Bozell would say, the logic of choice and the logic of liberty as primacy rather than a metaphysical absolute. And it's exactly what the traditionalists complained about. In the 80s, a specific dissenting group of conservatives became known as the paleoconservatives, and they complained, paleoconservative is the opposite of neoconservative essentially, and they complained about not only American culture, which they saw as a cesspool of feminism, pornography, and abortion, but also were specifically angry with the Reagan administration for failing to stop it. Pat Buchanan's run in 1992 as a paleoconservative spoke exactly to this issue, and he had specific paleoconservative advisors. The point here is that the traditionalist position has always been present in conservative intellectual circles, but I think generally as a minority report, and that has led to a sense of bitterness and frustration. I'm going to drag all of this forward to today, sort of in the interest of time. I would suggest that the traditionalist story illuminates parts of the contemporary right's thought world. For instance, if we look at some of the affiliations, ideas, or mentors cited by the likes of Patrick Deneen, the post-liberal academic at Notre Dame, and one-time mentor of Pete Hegseth, it's clear that he comes out very specifically from the traditionalist tradition. Likewise, Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option draws its Just So story directly from Richard Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences. In law, Catholic integralists like Adrian Vermeule are also, although I think more uniquely in Vermeule's case, within this tradition, sometimes explicitly, and see Bozell as kind of a precursor or martyr in their movement. At the more extreme end, parts of the paleo-conservative and social conservative New Right, both successors in a way of traditionalism, dabbled in anti-immigration politics and racial analysis. And one thinker in this vein, Samuel Francis, has been rediscovered by the current right as a prescient forebear and an intellectual cudgel with which to attack the old fusionism. Or we can trace parts of the alt-right directly to paleocons like Paul Gottfried, organizations like the H.L. Mencken Society, and outlets like Takis Mag, all connected with the traditionalist dissent from fusionalism. In the New York Times, I would suggest Ross Douthat would fall on the gentler end of this category as well. I don't want to make it sound as though I think the traditionalist branch of conservatism is responsible for all of this, or even the worst parts of Trumpism. It's only part of the story. At their best, I do think the traditionalists brought a humane, usually Christian attention to a higher meaning to politics and sought to soften the edges of conservative politics. But at their worst, traditionalists gave cover for the theocratic impulse and offered abstract spiritual justifications for liberal hierarchies embedded in American politics and culture. And to bring it all the way to Trump, I tend to think President Trump is basically pre-ideological. His policy moves and preferences seem instinctual to me rather than reasoned. I don't think he's a traditionalist in any meaningful sense. The conservative intellectual world that was built by Buckley and his successors therefore have a lot of open space to backfill the president's actions and agenda to make Trumpism seem something intelligible. The lesson that people sympathetic to traditionalism, I think of places like First Things magazine, took from the Trump election in 2016 was that the fusionist bargain was over and a renegotiation was possible. I'm not sure what a new fusionism will look like, perhaps just like the old one. Perhaps, as Ross Douthat hints, it'll be a dynamic populist fusionism based on, quote, the modest but real convergence between Muskian tech worldview and Vance's more neo-trad style of religious conservatism. Maybe fusionism is a dead category. I do wonder, though, whether J.D. Vance, a venture capitalist, a nationalist, a Catholic convert, and someone obviously familiar with the ins and outs of right-wing discourse, might, like Buckley, embody whatever fusion is coming. A lot of these came from First Things. They had a lot at stake, I think, in saying fusionism is over. Thank you. That's my talk.
We have time for questions. You can moderate.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Josh, thanks so much. I'm just going to ask you to tease out some things that I think are implicit in your talk, and really two related questions. One is, from Buckley to Douthat, by Vance, these Christians you talk about are really Catholics. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the centrality of Catholicism here. And then related to that, something you invoked, Carlism and Franco, there's a really striking kind of debt to European thinkers here, which has resurfaced in a powerful way recently. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. The question was about what is the role of Catholicism here, because it's obvious that converts are critical, and European thought. Those are both good questions. Not all of these guys were Catholics. Whittaker Chambers was a Quaker, despite his comment about Catholicism, and Richard Weaver, it's hard to, non-practicing Protestant, as best as anyone can tell. But it is true that Catholicism was central to so much of this. Some of it, at least within the small world of conservative intellectuals, is, I would say, biographical. William F. Buckley was a really charming guy, and he was a cradle Catholic who believed sincerely in it, and a lot of people wanted to be like him and emulated him, including in their religious faith. The bigger point, though, is that I think within the American context, which I would argue is fundamentally a liberal one, although you could argue about republicanism and so on. But within the American context, Catholicism is the most, I think, easily accessed non-liberal tradition that exists. You have, especially in the 1950s and 60s, if you read like Pat Buchanan's writings about the church, it is totalizing, even for him. And it's something that has an alternative sense of the nature of the life, the universe, and everything, alternative institutions that you can plug into. It has these beliefs and thick commitments that you can go to. And it's not just in the American context. You can look at plenty of converts from across the Anglosphere who are looking for deeper meaning, and Catholicism strikes them as the, again, most easily accessible and obvious alternative to a liberal outlook. The question about European thought, the thesis that I'm kind of advancing, and I don't do it so much in this talk, but the thesis I'm advancing in the book that I'm working on is that in the 40s and 50s, the conservative ideas had been discredited by the isolation had been the foreign policy preference of the old right. It had been discredited by the Second World War, and free enterprise had been discredited by the Great Depression. In a search to kind of revitalize the American right, these thinkers like Kirk and Weaver and Chambers, who was deeply European in the way that he saw the world, whether intentionally or not, they went to European thinkers to gain a new form of credibility and prestige. So supplementing that is an influx of European scholars fleeing the Nazis. Leo Strauss is a great example of this, who then start to impart, I guess, some European conservative ideas into the American context. But what I argue in the manuscript, which I didn't get into at all here, is that these ideas are great for building up an initial interest, an initial basis of cultural cachet, but they are alien, I think, to the American context, and you have to ground the American political conservatism in the American symbols and institutions. Hence, so much reference to the Constitution and the founding in later conservative thinking and writing. And that trajectory is one of the narratives that I have over the manuscript. I would say that with someone like Adrian Vermeule, I hope you're familiar with him, but one of the reasons I think he gets so much airtime today is because he's so weirdly European and interesting. And it's the fact that he's so European influenced makes him both interesting, but perhaps will limit his influence long term, or perhaps not. Yeah.
You had the Lionel Trilling quote at the beginning about
Yeah.
conservatism as durable mental gestures
Yeah.
from the liberal imagination.
Yeah.
Is that not? That seems like a correct account of American conservative thought, in the sense that insofar as American conservatism becomes intellectual, it becomes European.
I think that, one, I kind of hate the irritable mental gestures quote, but you have to use it because it's so good. It's in every single book, and my eyes will glaze over when I read it. But at the same time, I have it twice in my own manuscript because it suggests in some ways hubris, but almost lamentation about the nature of American conservative thought. I think your question, though, which is, isn't intellectual conservatism always just European and therefore not American? I think that gives short shrift to some of the serious thinkers who tried to intellectualize a lot of this stuff. Maybe you could argue that the neoconservatives who sprung up around Irving Kristol were a more authentic expression of kind of a conservative liberalism, at least for a time. But yeah, I think it gives short shrift, but at the same time, I primarily operate around the realm of intellectuals, and I think maybe broadly the way the right has often played out because of the dynamics of electoral politics it's often action and maybe irritable mental gestures, you know. But no, I think that's a little unfair, is what I was saying. Yeah.
I was on a Zoom chat last August with David Stockman when he, for the first time, I heard this idea that Trump represents center-right populism, and then Bobby Kennedy, RFK, Tulsi represents center-left populism. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the role of traditional conservatism within a movement that is
Yeah.
very broad-based populist movement.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think right away, because the question was, you know, how does populism fit in with traditional conservatism today? I would say right away, I would distinguish, do you mean traditional conservatism as like the fusionist bargain where it's, you know, Reaganism, or do you mean tradition in the like Brent Bozell sense? But I would say in two ways, I'll answer for both of them. I think it's true that right-wing populism has become, I think, the dominant form of right-wing politics today. I think it was quite often the case. You see it in Nixon, when George Wallace before Nixon. You see it in elements of Reagan, not necessarily the way that he governed, but certainly in some of the appeals that he made and some of the vote getting that he got. Right-wing populism is always there, and it's a really complex dynamic, the relationship between conservatism. In some ways, you could argue that National Review type conservatism was not, or National Review is often seen as like the gatekeeper of conservatism, but what if it wasn't the gatekeeper? What if it's just the, you know, definer of respectability in conservatism and is actually kind of doing a lot of covering for right-wing populism? I think that's certainly a dynamic that occurred. On the question, the relationship between traditionalism and populism, I think that traditionalist intellectuals, like your Ross Douthat, the relationship with the populist right is one of often seeing what they want to see in the populist right as, you know, something that we can use to defeat secular liberalism, because, you know, it's the people, the salt of the earth, still believe the right things even in an inchoate and impossible to articulate form. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of, from the intellectual space, there's some respectability granting and wishful thinking. Yeah.
Thanks. So there are a couple of figures in the talk, so Whittaker Chambers and Brent Bozell,
Yeah.
right? Ex-communists who went in for this like weird metaphysically loaded critique of modernity. I also want to add Malcolm Muggeridge in there, even though
Sure.
he's not American.
Yeah, yeah.
What gives?
Well, Brent Bozell was not an ex-communist. He was, though, a one world government, like a world federalism guy. But he wasn't an ex-com. But certainly Frank Meyer was. Frank Meyer, Whittaker Chambers, like big time. James Burnham, who I had up there and I think quoted really briefly, but I skipped the point I wanted to use him to make. In some ways, I think they were never reconciled with liberalism. They were radicals in a lot of ways, and they went from one radical view to another. You know, they went from left to right, skipping over the liberal center, or the vital center, if you like. But I think, you know, there are lots of ways you can explain it. They had a critique of liberalism. They lost faith in one thing, but they found a new faith in another thing. The critique of liberalism remained similar. I think that Meyer and Bozell and Chambers, you know, you don't want to psychologize, but they were extreme personalities in a lot of ways, in the ways that they behaved. Like Frank Meyer was nocturnal. Like he didn't sleep at night and he slept during the day. That suggests he's a kind of an interesting person. Brent Bozell was bipolar and an alcoholic, and I think that informed, you know, his worldview to some extent. Not to say this is the defining feature of his life, but he had tendencies to the extreme. I think even his biographer kind of suggests that way. Whittaker Chambers saw in like world historical tragic terms, and he brought that from his left to right movement. So yeah, I think it's partly ideological, partly biographical.
Early on, you mentioned the term nominalism.
Yeah.
And can you expound on that?
Sorry, I skipped right over that in the interest of time. Richard Weaver, in his story about what went wrong, traces it back to a 14th century debate which is a strange thing to do. Like, but he specifically says in the introduction to Ideas, or the preface to Ideas Have Consequences, that a title that he did not like or choose, which is a fact I enjoy. But he said that the point in which the West made its fateful decision was in a debate between theologians in the 14th century over whether or not, and I can't remember the ins and outs, but whether or not there are absolutes, or whether or not well, I guess there are not. Whether the idea of virtue refers to something concrete out there in the world, or whether it is just a word that we use to gesture at, like things that we observe. And William of Ockham, of Occam's razor fame, said that we just use words to refer to like actions and things. And there's a theological component to it that I'm butchering. But that position is nominalism, and Weaver says from that fateful step we have a downward decline to like the Enlightenment and secularism and rationalism and scientism, and ultimately man becomes, in gendered terms, man becomes the measure of all things, and that's what we've got to, and it's a disaster, and look around you. He was consciously kind of inverting Whig history to say instead of getting more and more freedom, we're getting more and more away from what we ought to be, which is interesting because he was much more of a Platonic than a religious thinker, and there's much more about him. He had backstopping all of this was his view of the antebellum South, but I won't go into all of that. But yeah, nominalism was where Weaver thought Western decline began, and I would stress that's not a view shared by everyone. It's a just so story that he told, and occasionally gets trotted out like by Rod Dreher in the Benedict Option.
Another question here, here. Yes. Go ahead.
One other question. George Nash, when he was writing his history, sort of had an intent. He became like a house historian within the conservatives, even though he's a scholar.
Yeah.
Matthew Continetti with his new history has a sort of intention. I'm curious. Of course, there's the Max Weber science and vocation of scholarly neutrality. But I'm curious, in writing a new history of American conservatism, what is your intention?
Well, I mean, ambitiously, I would like in some ways to replace George Nash's book. It's, how old is it now? It came out in '76, so it's 50 years old. And there have been other books that kind of cover a lot of these guys, but I don't think one that takes into consideration truly, the last edition came out in 2006, so there's 19 years that's happened even since then. And as you say, Nash was a house historian, folks like Lee Edwards as well, and Continetti, they approach it from the perspective of a conservative, and I think that makes them willing to be generous in their interpretations. I'm not saying that I'm parsimonious, but I think I'm less willing to sometimes let them get away with it, so to speak. But at the same time, it's not my intention to kind of string together every single racist thing that they said and say, look at these guys, they're just racists. So I would like to in some way supplant Nash's book. That's my ambition. I don't know if I will achieve it, but yeah. And it's to do that story, to tell a slightly different version of it, and to approach it for someone who is interested in, and perhaps at one stage was sympathetic, but is from the outside. Yeah.
Go ahead. Yes. One last question.
Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
I am struck by just how complex it is to use these words, right?
Yeah.
I know this about liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
This has been, my first book was on 19th century liberalism. Whenever I teach this, you have to really do all this work to unpack it. Similarly, obviously, for conservatism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're inherently relational, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm kind of wondering, to what extent, when I think of the 19th century and I think of continuities, the traditionalists that you described, right, who I think of as the future paleos,
Mm-hmm.
That is legible to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's a sort of an anti-individual.
Yeah.
That's why the Catholics make a lot of sense, right? It's an anti-market.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, it's an anti-market.
It's not totally, but enough.
At least
Yeah.
in the 19th century, this is where it's sort of going. These are those sort of values.
Gotcha.
And then, but of course, politics changes so much. So this is sort of like the marriage of political philosophy and you could either say political theory or just politics itself. You know, people can be purists in their ideologies, but it's hard to be a purist
Yeah.
in pragmatic politics, right? And so after 45, I mean, when liberalism has changed so much, right? When
Yeah.
it's no longer a free market.
Yeah.
They're not the 19th century conservative anymore, so the conservative, that one strand of it sort of becomes that. So it's like,
It's
it's a mess, but it's a mess for these sort of relational reasons and political reasons that seem to be explainable and yet still really incoherent.
It's explainable, but like you're absolutely right. It's a conceptual mess, partly because, for exactly the historic, political philosophical reasons you describe, and then partly just due to nomenclature. I mean, I can think of at least 3 groups called the New Right, 2 that are called New Conservatism, who are in opposition to one another.
And the economy, there's like a
Precisely. I mean, Buckley gets called a neoconservative, and then obviously the neoconservatives around Irving Kristol. So even just, I mean, as a historian, you have to kind of either you use what they're calling themselves, or you impose, terminology, which isn't great. But I was just adding Republican right to a chapter, and I don't think they were really calling themselves that, but you have to lump at some point, right? Yeah, it is. It's a messy story, and you can simplify it somewhat, but it does have the twists and turns. I really like, that's why I like the Norberto Bobbio's definition of left and right, which is about the relationship to hierarchy, because if you listen to conservative intellectuals today, they'll say, oh, it has everything to do with relation to the state, and I think that just messes things up completely. You cannot have a coherent story about left and right unless everyone's switching sides, and then if everyone's switching sides on a spatial metaphor, it's useless. So yeah, agree, it's a mess, and part of it's the names they give themselves, or their critics give them.
All right, well, we look forward to the book. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.